All right, everyone. Again, this is Ryan Hale with Fruition Partners. With me, I have Andy Whitlatch, who is going to be doing the presentation. So we're going to go ahead and get started. What I'm here to do is give a little bit of history as far as, who is Fruition Partners, what do we do, then I'll pass it over to Andy. And just an important note, if you have any questions, feel free to enter them into the question box at any point in time. But we basically do save a couple of minutes at the end to address any of the questions. So if you ask a question, it doesn't get answered immediately, we will try our best to address that in a timely manner at the end of the webinar. So, history of Fruition Partners. We're an IT service management consulting and education company. We work primarily with clients in the United States, but we also have a couple of international clients as well. We've been around for about 7 years, and we are, industry agnostic would be the best way to put it. We work with financial services firms, .coms, law firms, anybody that really needs help either with ServiceNow.com or with ITIL or ITSM process work. And really what we try to focus on is kind of complete IT service integration. So that's everything from staff education, which will help kind of establish buy-in for a broader ITSM initiative. We can take over the administration and the build-out of your ServiceNow application, and then we also build customized applications on top of that platform. And we do publish the slide deck at the end of the webinar, so this is just a quick little what our customers say. I'm not going to run through the bullet points, but that will be available on our website. And in addition to the integration, we also like to think of ourselves as a one-stop shop from an ITSM perspective. And really what we do is educate, consult, and then try to automate and provide value both through ITIL and through ServiceNow. And with that brief introduction, I'm going to hand it over to Andy Whitlatch, who is one of our asset and configuration management specialists, both from the process perspective and also from the ServiceNow perspective. So you guys are in great hands with Andy. Like I said, he'll answer as many questions as he can at the end of the webinar. And I'm going to hand it over to Andy. Hope you guys enjoy the show.
All right, thank you, Ryan. Thanks, everyone, for joining us today. As Ryan mentioned, my name is Andy Whitlatch, and today I'll be taking you through the asset and configuration management data import process. Again, post any questions. If we have some time at the end, I'll try to get through as many as possible. And as well, if we start experiencing any technical difficulties at any point, go ahead and post that too, and I will try to address those if I can. So with ServiceNow, being as flexible as it is, there's a lot of different areas that the data import could cover. It can be used in many of the different applications on almost any table in ServiceNow, and we could talk for days on the different areas of importing data. So today we're just going to focus on asset and configuration management. So the first question is why? Why do we want to import data? How does that help us achieve our business goals? First of all, most mature lifecycle programs have data stored throughout their environment coming from different sources, whether that's external databases or external reports, internal databases such as SCCM, which is out there collecting information on computers, or JetAdmin collecting information on printers, or like an HP SIM collecting information on servers. Whatever platforms you have in your environment, it's a likely chance there's some database collecting information on those. So importing that data into one location kind of gives you a one place where you can go and view information, all this different information that's out there in your environment in one place, and kind of consolidates those different sources and makes it easier to manage. In addition to those different databases you can pull from, there's also different inventory spreadsheets. I've seen some clients have spreadsheets that are managed all throughout the country at different locations. So when it comes time to report, at the end of a year, CFO CFO wants to know how much they've spent or what we have in inventory, you can go to one place in a CMDB and find that information. So you can import these spreadsheets, these distributed spreadsheets, and centralize the management of those asset records. And that's not so much a political statement. That you can still have the ability to manage those in a distributed manner politically, but physically they're all those records are in one place. And once you have those all those configuration items, we call them CIs or assets, in the CMDB, you can then start to track relationships with those and your other applications and major IT events such as incidents, changes, problems. You can track which servers will be affected or which desktops will be affected if a server goes down, and you can relate those back to those items individually. As I mentioned, this creates some transparency. Your ITIL users that have access to ServiceNow can go in. They can look at assets. They can look at the records. They can also do their own reporting. They don't have to submit a request to someone in another department to pull back a report. They can go into the tool. They can bring up their criteria that they want to see and report on it and do an export to an Excel file or a PDF or anything like that. As I mentioned, you can kind of control who has the ability to do that. So one of the other benefits of having this in one place is you can manage who is able to upload that data or to touch that data and change information on those CI records. You can do that through roles in ServiceNow and define who does and who does not have access to that information. So all the things I just kind of mentioned there are really essentially the basis of a mature asset lifecycle program. So here's a nice little chart I like to show people that really kind of puts it in a visual aspect here. You can kind of see how everything relates together. So across the top there, across the top of the screen here, you have all those internal databases that I mentioned. So you have Landesk picking up computer information, maybe a BES server in your environment picking up BlackBerries, and so on. And those all can feed back. You can set up scheduled imports, on a nightly basis, or you can kick those off manually and bring that information into the database. And along with those, you have all the internal or external reports. Maybe you have some purchase reports from some vendors, such as CDW Insight, whoever you're buying from. You can grab that data and bring that in as well. And what happens, and we'll get into this a little bit more later, so your assets that you're seeing, if serial number XYZ was purchased last month from CDW and you have a serial number, a unique identifier of that asset, and that asset later gets deployed and it gets picked up on Landesk, now you have information coming from two different sources, and that information can coalesce or match on the serial number, and now you have one place to go where you can see information from both data sources. So once everything comes into the database here, now you have it in one spot. Now you can do reporting, whether that's through Excel, on an ad hoc basis. You can define reports that you want to see, or you can maybe schedule some reports or build some reports out within ServiceNow, and those are managed by another group. As I mentioned as well, you can also relate these assets in your database to change management or incident management or problem or whatever other applications you happen to be using. So before we get started, kind of good to go over and get an understanding of the table schema within ServiceNow. ServiceNow, like most databases, has a parent-child tables or extended tables. So everything doesn't reside on one table. It's normalized out to the different aspects. So as you can imagine, with the parent-child relationship, fields that are present on the parent table will also be available on the child table, and that's important to remember when you're defining what kind of assets you're importing, whether it's a computer or a monitor or a printer, or if you're importing them all at the same time. You want to be able to know which fields are on the table that you're importing data to. So for our purposes, CMDB-CI is kind of the major overall table that kind of handles everything within the configuration application. So that's going to handle most of our asset imports. Underneath that, then, in this kind of little quick diagram down here, you can see CMDB-CI as the parent table. And underneath that, you can there are child tables, computer, and under computer is server. And you can also create, if you need to, other tables such as monitor. Monitors not out of box. So I just kind of put that in here as an example of a custom table that you can extend from CMDB-CI. So monitor will contain all the fields that CMDB-CI has, as well as some custom fields if you want to put them on a monitor level that only monitors have, like a monitor screen size, or whether it's an LCD or LED. As I mentioned, they can be extended or they can be free-floating, so these don't have to be connected to CMDB-CI. They can be on their own. But what determines what table a record will reside on is the thing called its class name. So this class name, if it's a sysclass name of computer, then it will reside on the computer table. If it's a monitor, it will reside on the monitor table, or so on and so forth. So the best kind of a little tip here. The best practice would be to always try to import data to the lowest possible table. Meaning, if you have a spreadsheet of all computers, or a data source that is all computers, you would want to try to import that to the computer table as opposed to the CMDB-CI table. And we'll get into a little bit why later, or you'll be able to see that a little bit clearer later. But it complicates things. If you have all computers, then all the fields you should need for those computers would be on the computer table. If you import it to a higher table, such as the CMDB-CI, you might not be able to import all the data as easily. You can still get in there, but it's just going to complicate things for fields that are unique to computers. We'll get into that a little bit more in a minute. So here I've got a nice little diagram from the ServiceNow wiki that gives a good kind of overhead view of how the data gets flowed into the system. And we'll go through each of these steps individually, but you can see it starts up here at the top with a data source. Again, that can be many different forms. Then gets loaded into an import set table, and then once it's on the table, it gets sent through these transform maps, and then onto the target table. Like I said, we're going to go into those in more detail now. So step one is the data source. And ServiceNow is pretty flexible as far as data sources go. You have quite a few options. As I mentioned, you have reports that you can import, and ServiceNow accepts CSV, XLS, and XML. Of CSV and XLS, it's typically recommended that you use a CSV. Sometimes Excel has some crazy background formatting that you can't see, but that the system might interpret kind of funny, and you might end up with some blank cells. So whenever possible, I always recommend using CSV because it removes some of that formatting and puts it in a standard format. You can expect it the same way every time. If you have another source, you have an FTP site, you can also use that as well. ServiceNow supports FTP, FTPS, and SCP for file retrievals. And then, as I mentioned earlier, with a BES server, or SCCM, or Landesk, you can also set up a JDBC connection. There are some drivers available out of box for some of the basic situations, but I know some drivers, if you need extra, or if there's a different one that's not out of box, those be obtained as well. There may be a fee for those that would have to be determined on your needs. And then the other source, kind of along those same lines, is an LDAP server. If you were lucky enough to join us for our LDAP webinar by Matt Hawk, he kind of briefly showed you through how to set up an LDAP connection. So once we have our data source, then we can start importing. So actually, along with this slide deck, I'm going to run you through each of these steps in ServiceNow, because it kind of helps, I think, to be able to see it actually happen here as well. So I'm using just an internal here Fruition Sandbox instance. So today we're just going to be uploading just a simple spreadsheet, CSV spreadsheet. So I've prepared a sample with just some dummy data in here, just a few basic fields that would be common to an asset management program. So this will be our data source. So let me minimize that. And the easiest way, actually, ServiceNow makes this pretty easy for importing just a file, is to go ahead and do it, to upload it, to create the data source. So for our purposes today, we're going to be in this system import set application. Here you'll see, I'll just give you a brief run through if you're not familiar with the system import set application. I'll just give you a quick run through here. So load data is where we're going to go to actually import our data. You can also create a transform map, which we'll get into later. Here are your data sources that will list out all data sources that are currently in ServiceNow, as well as your transform maps, and then scheduled imports. If you have scheduled imports, such as like a nightly BES import or a nightly Landesk import, you can manage those through this scheduled imports module. And then here you have some import sets. This will list out all of your actual imports that have been performed and their progress. And then here at the end, we'll show you the transform history. We'll go through a brief check of that. We'll get into that more later. And then all your import set tables that are set up here, you can see those as well. So let's go ahead and get started with the import. So we'll go to load data. Now we have a new one, so just for the purpose of this webinar, we'll do create new. If you have an existing one, once it's created, you can reuse the same one over and over again. You can pick use existing and then just select it from this drop-down box. For now, we'll go new, and we'll just call it webinar imports. And you can see underneath there it's setting up our table name. So this will be the table that gets referenced as our source table through the whole procedure. So we'll want to remember that webinar import table name. Okay, now we're going to, you have a few options here. If you were going from a data source such as the BES server, you would set that up and you can select it from this drop-down box. As I mentioned today, because of time, we can't really get into all the other different data sources that are possible, so we're just going to do a basic spreadsheet. So we'll upload an Excel file. Also, we'll just do a browse. The file is called webinar sample data. Now the next two columns, or next two fields here, if you're using a CSV, the worksheet number refers to which worksheet in your data source the data resides on. If you're using a CSV, it standardizes it so there's only one tab, so you don't really have to worry about that. If you're using an XLS and there's multiple tabs, you'll want to specify which tab your data is on. And the next column is, or the next field is the header row. So that refers to the header row that ServiceNow is going to look for in order to find the column headers. So if you have a purchase report that has a summary, up at the top, and then the data actually starts in row 15, you want to be sure to mention that in this field. So now that our data source information is in here, we're just going to click Go, and this will create that import set table name. So this will bring in that information to our import set table. Okay, so it's complete. It's a success. We can see here that there were 9 rows processed. All 9 were inserted. Let's go back to the slide here. There was no errors, by the way, which is good. So let's go back to the presentation and talk about an import set table. So we just imported our data source to an import set table. So what is an import set table? That is kind of a temporary staging table that ServiceNow creates or maintains that holds that data prior to the transform, which we'll get into next. That table essentially looks for the headers that are expected to be imported and places the data in the correct header on the table, underneath that correct header on the table, and puts it in the right columns. So it's not set in stone. One thing to mention is if you need to add fields later, or your requirements kind of change over time. So if you need to add a field later or remove a field, you can do that pretty easily. They can be added to the transform or to the import set table, but you also want to make sure that you add them to the transform map so ServiceNow knows what to do with that data at a later time. And once your data is loaded, you can actually view and verify the data sitting on that table and make sure it was loaded properly, which I'll give you a quick glance at that. ServiceNow makes it pretty easy. So this lets us know that the data was loaded. We can actually go and click this loaded data link and see the information sitting on our import set table. So you can see here there's a few rows that there's a few columns that the system automatically creates, including the import set number. So this is a unique ID for this import job, which can be used later to look up anything that might have went wrong, or just as an audit point for your data import. And then you'll see here are fields that were in the file that we uploaded. So you have serial number, manufacturer, model, etc. And then it mentions some target information. So target is where this data is pointed at, where it's going to, and we're going to define that next in our transform map. So back to the presentation. On to the transform map. So you can think of a transform map kind of as a set of instructions. It tells ServiceNow what to do with the information it's receiving. So it tells it what the name of the field that's coming in is, and it tells it the relationship between what's being imported and what's already in the database. So it points it in the right direction, tells it what to do with that data. Once you create that transform map, it's associated with the import set table. So we created our webinar import table. So any map that we create now is going to be associated with that table. So every time we do an import, that same import, it will use the same map to import that data, to send it into the CMDB. And vice versa, each import set table or each import set requires at least one map, so it has to know what to do with it once it has it. But you can use more than one map. If you have data in your file that's going to several different tables, so you have computers and printers and servers, you can set up multiple maps, and it'll take some customization, but you can set up some multiple maps to point that information to the correct table. As a reference, a transform map can only point to one table out of box. So that would be why you would need multiple transform maps for a single import set. So a couple things to understand before we get into the transform map. Here I will show you the next screen here. If we go back one screen to our summary for the data load, it gives us the option to create a transform map right through this process. So we'll go ahead and click there. Okay, so here we have our basic information. So let's go back to the slide and a few things to understand here. We'll start off with you want to label it accurately, so you know which transform this map is gonna handle. And there's also a system-generated metadata field here that just captures the date and time. So as I mentioned earlier, the data source becomes your source table. That import set table is where this map is going to look for information that it needs to transform. So the source table is the import set table where that data is stored temporarily. On the other side is the target table. That's where the data is going. So in this sample, you can see the source was a data source called a uSample import. That was the table, and this was pointed at the computer table. So it was an import of computers. Active just tells you whether or not that's available for use. If that's unchecked, then you won't be able to select it when doing one of these imports. Order is if you have multiple import maps for the same import, then you can determine what order those are going to run in with this number here. 100 being first, 200 being second, 300 third, and so on. The run business rules is if you have any other business rules that are firing off of an insert or an update, you can determine whether those should run or not during your import. And then next would be enforce mandatory fields. So if your destination table, let's say our computer table for this example, said that any time a record was created, it had to have a serial number. What this field here does is it enforces that. So if we try to import a record without a serial number, then it's going to reject that row. So it will make sure that each item created has a serial number or whatever field that is in your environment. And then last on this screen here is the copy empty fields. This will copy empty fields on a source table to the target table. So potentially here you could overwrite data that's already in your system with an empty value or a null value, which could be good in some situations, but most of the time for asset management, I wouldn't recommend turning that on because as I showed earlier, you've got data coming in from different sources throughout the environment. So if any of those share a field, say, for a computer, say you have a purchase report that has the hard drive size on it, but you're also getting hard drive size from a Lambda type discovery tool. If one of those is blank, but the other one has information, and this field is checked, then you could potentially be writing over valuable information that was picked up from the other source with a blank value. So just be cautious if you're going to use that. And another kind of idea here with these transform maps is the coalesce function. It's not on the screen here, but I will show you once we start creating the map where you can select that. Coalesce is essentially the method of matching imported data or imported records to existing records. So if we choose to coalesce on a serial number, for instance, because you typically want to pick a unique ID. So serial number usually works for asset management. So if we have different data sources coming in with information about serial number XYZ that information will get matched to the existing record in the CMDB and update the existing record. That way you don't have multiple records with different information about the same asset. So let's go ahead and create or do the first part of creating our transform map. So again, you want to name it something you can remember or that will easily relate it to the import set table you're using. So we're just going to call this webinar imports transform. So our source table is, of course, our webinar import table that we just created. And this file is all computers. So we're going to point this at the computer table within ServiceNow. Get past it. Where to go? There we go. CMDB CI computer. Okay. So we're just going to make sure it's active. We don't really have any business rules or anything like that. This will be the only map. Here you have the option of, and this is one of the places that I'll talk about here in a second. Once we get back to the slide here, you have the option of running a script versus the transform maps. So let me hold off on showing you that here, and I will just save, and then we'll get into actually creating the maps or the instructions. So you'll notice once I saved it, some additional options came up for creating the maps. So let's go to the slide and go through those first before we actually do them. So the first would be to just manually create each of the field maps. You can do this by selecting the New button. And you'll be able to select just each field from a drop-down list. There are some advantages to doing this way. You have a few more options when you're creating the field map, but you can only do them one at a time. The second way, which you can do multiple at the same time, is the Mapping Assist, which it gives you a nice link here too. The Mapping Assist is a user-friendly interface that allows you to just do a click and drag and match up the fields kind of next to each other, and it allows you to see the data from both the source and the target so that you can kind of get a better idea of what needs to be mapped where. And the last choice is automatic mapping, which ServiceNow will just map the fields that have the exact same names and automatically set that for you. Now, nothing is in stone here. You can mix and match. You don't have to do just one. You don't have to pick just manual or automatic mapping. You can do a combination of all of them for whatever suits your needs. So let's go to ServiceNow, and I'll show you an example of each of those. So here, let's just start off by doing the auto map. Now, as I mentioned, this will map fields with the same name. So it's kind of limited. It gives you a good starting point, but it's kind of limited because it only matches fields that have the exact same name. And many times that's not actually the case. So here we found 3 that it set up and matched to each other. But our import table had 5 or 6. So let's go to the Mapping Assist and pick up. I'll show you an example of that, and we'll pick up the rest of the fields here. So we have PO number. You can see it populates information from the source table, and you have the target table on your right, and then these are the list of the fields available. There are some extra fields in here that our system generated, which you may want. You can grab information on who created the record, or when it was created and who created it, as well as some other metadata for that asset. But all that you really need to do, and this is the easy part, is just to click and drag. So model, it missed model. So this is from our source table. We'll click and drag that to the middle. And now we want to match that up with the field on our computer table. And the field that we're looking for is called model ID. There it is. So you can either click and drag, as I did with that, or you can just double click. And that added it to the top, so we want to move it down and make sure it's right next to model. Let's see what other fields were on our import. Model unit price and purchase date. So let's grab unit price here real quick. And I'm going to click and drag that. I'm going to save the purchase date one for our manual creation. I'll show you how to manually create that. All right, so now we have, for our purposes, now we have all the fields we want. So we're going to save, and that takes us back to our import map screen. So now we're still missing purchase date. Let's go through the third option, and we'll create that manually. So click on New. And here, again, you'll see the source table and the target table. Those are pre-populated with the same values as for the map as a whole. And then we have some other options here. We have our source field and our target field. So this is where we want to grab our purchase date. And you'll notice kind of the same thing, that the source fields are always on the left and the target fields are always on the right, and you're kind of matching them both together. So here we've got purchase date, and in ServiceNow it's just called purchased. Now you'll notice, since this is a date field, it brought up an extra field here. This is the format of the date that it expects to see, and I'll show you here in a minute. We'll talk about this a little more. Dates can be tricky. So here's a list out of box of what date formats are available. We'll just select this one here. So dates can be pretty tricky. If it's not formatted properly, ServiceNow won't know how to interpret it and bring it into the database. So we will save it. So now we have our full set of fields for our transform map. Now let's go back to the slide and talk about some of these different things that I just mentioned. So as I mentioned, dates can be tricky. There's a certain list here of values that it expects to see. So when you're importing data from a spreadsheet or from a database, you want to make sure that that date value matches the format that ServiceNow expects to see. It is possible to do some customization in this area so that it can accept more. You can write scripts that will break down a date by each, it'll separate it on the dash or the hyphen, and it will break apart each individual section and then put it back together in the date that you want to see. So there is customization available, but again, that's something you'd have to do on your own or have somebody help you with. The other kind of field is choice lists. These are fields, like a manufacturer field where you have a set of choices that you want to choose from. So you have a list of verified manufacturers. So when importing to this field, you have some options as to what happens when a new field or when a new value is being brought in. So let's say, for example, you have Hewlett-Packard in your manufacturers list, and let's say you import a record and it has HP. So what do? There's an option here to kind of keep your data standard, or you can allow it in. So you have 3 different options. The first, create, allows you to create that new choice within the database. So now, once that record is inserted into your database, you'll have Hewlett-Packard, and then you'll also have HP. Same company. If you don't care, that's fine. You can have as many different choices as you want there. If you do care, if you want to have want to try to keep that data standard, you can use one of these next two options. So the second option is to ignore that value. And what happens is when it comes in and it recognizes HP is not does not match an existing record in the database, then it will ignore that value. However, the rest of the record is still imported. So that can be good or that can be bad. If that leads to that field not being populated, then that's something you can either go back and re-upload your file once you've changed HP to Hewlett-Packard, or you can just go to the record and edit it manually. The last option is to reject. So what happens in this scenario is if HP is already in the list, or Hewlett-Packard, I'm sorry, Hewlett-Packard is already in the list, and HP comes in on a new file, it will reject that entire record, so it won't import any of the information for that record into the database, and it'll just move on to the next one. So I'll show you real quick an example of that. As I mentioned, manufacturer is one of those choice list fields. So here, once the manufacturer target field is selected, this choice action comes up. So here you see you have the option of doing the create, ignore, or reject. And in this scenario, we're just going to do a create. So now I kind of want to go through some of the additional options you have. So here, at different points in the transform map, you have the option of doing maps or scripts for certain areas. A map is a good idea when you have data that's relatively clean, or just there's no logic being required on imports. In other words, the data from the spreadsheet is going straight into the database. There's no cleansing or standardization or any calculations that need to be done. On the other side, a script is going to be needed if you're doing calculations of any type with the data in the field. Again, if you're cleansing or standardizing data more so than just the list option that we created, or if you're doing any complex business logic during the import, which can also be achieved through business rules. We're not going to get into that too much because that could be another long conversation. So here you'll see a couple examples of where you might use a script. The one in example 1 just shows a simple calculation that takes the source data. So this is a memory field, a RAM memory field, and converts it from gigabytes down to megabytes. And the reason you might want to do that is most, when you speak commonly about a RAM, you're talking in gigabytes. If a machine has 4 gigabytes and you say 4 gigabytes. However, most discovery tools go out and discover RAM information in something other than gigabytes. So it might be in kilobytes or megabytes. So in order for those two data points to mesh up on the same record, if they're coming in from 2 different sources, you want those numbers to agree. So you might do a calculation to convert those to the same unit of measure. The second example there is an example I got from the wiki as well. This is an example of doing an import with multiple types of assets on it that are going to different tables. As I mentioned, this class name is what determines what table that record is going to reside on. So this example here uses the operating system on the source table to determine which table the record is going to reside on. So here you can see it's looking at the operating system and sending it to either the Linux server table or the Win server table. Those are just a couple examples. ServiceNow is incredibly flexible, so you can really script to your heart's content in some of these areas where you have the need to do so. So let's go back and I'll show you some of the different options of where you can use a script. So in an individual field map, such as if we're doing the memory situation, if you wanted to put a memory calculation in here, I'll just use this field since we have it up. You can select this use source script, and here is where you would put your script that does the quick calculation. I'm not going to put anything here because this is the manual or the manufacturer field. But you'll notice that once you click use script, your source field goes away. So what this does is it takes that information you need to define, what the source is going to be, and you point it to the target field where that's going. So your source in this instance would need to be manually spelled out. So we'll update. So you see another option here to run a script, and this is if you want to explicitly tell the system what to do with the fields. When I click the check mark here, you'll notice all those maps went away. So this gives you the option to, on a whole job level, script what's going on, where fields are going, if there's any business rules or any other things you need to achieve while importing data. You can do that in this screen as well. And the other spot that you can utilize scripts within the import process, you can still utilize the transform maps, but if you have some other options or other requirements during your import, you can click on this Transform Scripts tab, and here you can create new scripts based on whatever your needs are. So we'll go ahead, I'll show you some options within this. So here you have the screen, and for your script, when is a drop-down box of a few transformation events that signify when this script is going to be fired, and that's actually one of the slides. Oh, sorry, going out of order here. Again, we'll talk about some of the variables here first before we get into that transform event here. I put that on hold for a second. So some of the script variables that you have available to you when you're scripting, whether that's on the job level or in this screen that I just showed you there, was again this idea of source and target. Source being the information that is coming in. So in this case, it would be our import set table, and target being where that data is going to reside in the system. So one of the other objects available is the import log. So when you're scripting, ServiceNow gives you a platform to kind of send string messages back to the user or whoever is doing the importing. So you have a few different levels of log that correspond to some other events or the severity of the message that you want to send. There's an info message, which is just kind of some additional information, just some standard text, maybe the import has finished or something like that. A warning is something maybe a little more serious, something you might want to know about, and that again can be any message that you want in there. And then there is of course something that's really important that you want to see trick is when you're setting up these imports, if you come across a problem, if you're doing a script and you have a problem, it's the information is not getting uploaded like you think it should. This log is actually a pretty handy tool to use in troubleshooting. So you can actually put some of your other variables into the log and have it show you what data is actually being imported. You can customize it any way you want in that log with information from your script. So it's nice to have that available to kind of help troubleshoot as well. Also available are a couple flags that you can use during your scripting. The first one is the ignore flag, and this is just a true/false variable that allows you to skip over a current record. So if a record is being analyzed in your script and it meets a certain condition, you can set that ignore flag to true, and then that record will be skipped and it'll move on to the next one. Same thing with the error flag. However, the error flag can be used to stop processing altogether. So if you're importing data and it triggers an event in your script or meets a certain condition, you can set that error flag to true and stop the processing of the file. So now back to the transformation events. As I showed you, you have the option of doing several different events here that define when exactly your script is going to be run. So we'll just go through those here real quick. So the first option is on start. This means that the script is going to run at the start of the job, the entire job, prior to processing any records, so right at the beginning. On complete would be the opposite of that it runs at the end of the job after all records have been processed. So you can see in most of these situations, if you want a notification, you can script an email notification, signifying the start of a transformation job or the end of an import job. And you can customize that obviously to whoever you want. The next one is on before. So this means the script is actually being run before each record in that file is being processed. So if we have 10 records in our file, the script is going to run before each one of those 10 records gets transformed. On after would be similar. That's after each one of those 10 records get processed. And then our last few have to do with some of those different types of fields that we're importing data to. So on choice create, if you remember with the manufacturer, the example where you can select whether you want a new choice to be created, ignored, or rejected. This on choice create transformation event allows you to, again, customize an action based on the creation of a new choice. So let's say that new manufacturer of HP is added to the list, and you can send an email notification anytime a new value such as that is added to the list. Foreign insert is similar. What the foreign insert references is a reference field. So if your import file has a username, and your usernames are kept on a user table, anytime a record is imported and it's a new username that's not recognized on the user table, you have the same option to run a script at that time, or to notify maybe an admin, say, hey, a new user was just created on the user table from this import. And then on reject, again, it relates to those previous two. If your choice create says you want to reject that row and not allow HP to be created, then you can run a script in that occasion as well. This also works for the foreign insert. If you have it so that a username cannot be created from an import file, it has to be created through another source, then you can fire an event based on that rejection as well. And those would need to be set in the transform map. So you have to tell the transform map to reject those. And as I mentioned, you can do any event that you want off of those, or any notification that you want off of those events, such as sending emails or firing a business rule or anything like that. So let's go back to ServiceNow and actually transform this information. So we've got our name, we've got our source table, we've got our target table, and we have some of our other characteristics set. We're not going to do any scripts, so for now we'll just do our PO numbers and our serial number and bring those information in. Now, as I mentioned earlier, with the coalesce, we want to make sure that records being imported are matched up against existing records within the database. So it gives you the option in ServiceNow to select which field that you want to coalesce on. So we're going to set this coalesce to true. So now our information coming into the system is going to coalesce around serial number. It's going to match new records to existing records. You can do a coalesce on more than one field. In that case, remember that both of those fields have to match in order for it to update the existing record. So if we chose serial number true to coalesce on serial number and PO number, both of those, the PO number and the serial number, would have to match an existing PO number and a serial number. If one of those was different, then it's going to create a new record. So that being said, I believe we're ready to transform. So we'll go ahead and transform. At this point, our target or our transform map is available here. If you have multiple maps, they might be listed out on the left side. You want to make sure they're all on the right hand side. And we'll go ahead and click transform. And now our information is it's in the system. So once the transformation is done, you can see from the flow that the target table gets updated with the information from the new source, the new file, and those CI records can now be viewed in the database. The other thing you want to do after an import is to always check the transform history. So I realize we're running out of time here. I'll show you this briefly. On the left-hand navigation here is the transform history section. So you'll notice on the import file, I had all these dates formatted one way, and then I had a last one that was formatted differently. So I just kind of want to show you what you'll see in the event that a date doesn't match. So this is our set here. This is the one that was just uploaded, called Webinar Import. We'll click on this button here. So now you can see there were 9 total records. There were 9 inserted and 1 error. And that error, as you can see here, listed on the errors tab, corresponds to that date that was formatted incorrectly. So you can see a message here. The format did not match the string that it was expecting to see, so that caused an error. So we can go to the actual database and view that record. So real quick, go into configuration. There it is. And we'll be down in the base items computers tab, or computer module. So here you can see these are the sample serial numbers, are the ones that were just imported. There's some other data in here out of box. So that was the sample serial number 9 was the one with the bad date. So we'll go into that record, and here you can see that it imported all the data. Our serial number, manufacturer, model ID, but since that date didn't match, it didn't get imported to the dates field. If you look at another one of our records that everything was as expected, you can see that they did get transferred in there. So that's just one thing to keep in mind when you're importing data, that some of those fields can be tricky. But overall, the process is pretty easy. So that is the end of it here. That's the last step. I know we did have some questions, but I know we're running short on time. So unfortunately, we won't be able to get to those. I apologize for that. It did run a little bit longer than expected. So again, that's the gist of importing data to ServiceNow. Thank you for joining us today, and have a great weekend.